your success at work, your happiness at work depends so much on the quality of your working relationships, according to our guest today on the Leadership Standard, Michael Bungay Stanier. My friend has written the best-selling coaching book of this century, The Coaching Habit, with thousands of reviews on Amazon, one of which is mine. I did give him a 5-star review. And he's also written other books like How to Begin. And the book we're going to be talking about today, How to Work with Almost Anyone. Not only that, but Michael is the founder of Box of Crayons, a learning and development organization that helps managers move from less advice-driven and more curiosity-led. And for the tech audience who's listening to this, his CEO is a member of a tech group, which we just found out. And not only that, Mike is the Canadian Coach of the Year, has been named a global coaching guru since 2014, and was a Rhodes Scholar. Michael, welcome to the Leadership Standard.
Jamie, the problem with such a nice introduction like that is it feels like it's all going to be an anticlimax after that. So I will do my very best to live up to it. Thank you. But yeah, we were saying before we went on air just how important tech has been to Shannon, the CEO of Box of Crayons, the company I founded, how it's really amplified her leadership skill. Just 2 days ago, we were discussing a brand new business strategy that's come out of a tech conversation. So I'm really delighted to be talking to the tech community.
That is wonderful to hear. And in your book, How to Work with Almost Anyone, you talk about the keystone conversations. What are the keystone conversations? Let's start there.
Well, the starting point is, you set this up beautifully when you said, look, our happiness and our success at work depends so much on the quality of our working relationship. And for everybody listening and watching, you know this to be true. It doesn't matter what you're working on. If it's a tough working relationship, it stains everything, it taints everything. Even if it's a really cool project. If it's even if it's a not great piece of work, but you're working with somebody who you really love working with, it's going to be okay. But most of us don't do that much to actively manage our working relationships. We cross our fingers, we pray to the gods, we hope for the best, and you roll the dice. And if you're lucky, you get some good ones, and if you're unlucky, you get some bad ones. And I would love everybody in the organization, from the executive team downwards, to more actively work to shape what I call a BPR, a best possible relationship. So, I know not every working relationship is going to be amazing, but every working relationship can be the best version of itself, a BPR. So you're looking for a working relationship that has 3 qualities to it. It needs to be safe. People feel they have the fear removed so they can bring out the best version of themselves. It needs to be vital. So there's challenge and there's provocation, and you get to push each other, and there's the right balance between safe and vital, and they need to be repairable. In other words, when it goes wrong, because we all know it always goes wrong, sometimes in a big way, more often in a kind of minor way, it needs to be fixed. And if you've got a BPR, a best possible relationship that is safe and vital and repairable, you're more likely to have more happiness and more success at work. So that's the big idea. And the practical tool is this keystone conversation, which it's simple but difficult. Have a conversation about how you work together before you jump into the work itself. And Jamie, we should have done this before we hit record, and we can do it right now, which is like, rather than us, we got on and we had a bit of banter because you and I are friends and we go way back. And I got to meet the team that's producing it, the producer and the tech folks. So this is great. But what I should have said is like, Jamie, tell me what it's like. Tell me, when you think of the best guests you've had on this podcast, who were they and what did they do that made this a really great pod for you? And I could tell you, Jamie, let me tell you about my favorite interviewers, the ones that really bring out my best. And let me tell you, and we could have had that conversation to give us the best chance to show up and kind of rock it at this interview. Now, who knows what's going to happen? It could go horribly wrong any moment now.
Well, a guest that I liked having recently was Seth Godin, who you wrote a book with. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think what I really liked about having Seth Godin, and it was a really popular interview in terms of the impact that it had on this community from the feedback almost immediately, was there was a sense of clarity, simplicity, and usefulness in the tools that Seth provided. And he provided it even though he's a 22 times best-selling author and he's a legend and an icon in
Yes.
terms of business, book writing, and all of the other things that he contributes and adds value to business leaders around the world. He does it with a sense of humility, and he shows up treating me as the interviewer, even though he didn't know me beforehand, with a level of respect and giving me
Yeah.
the same level of attention that he gave with interviewers who I knew he had a deeper relationship with.
He's so good like that.
He
He's
is.
got the ability to be present and non-hypey, but deeply generous in the way that he works.
What
So,
about you?
well, for me, I like an interviewer that first of all does know a little bit about my work, and I've had a few podcast interviews where it's clear that all they've read is the title of the book, and maybe not even that. And those are the worst of interviews. But for me, there's also a willingness to have a bit of a banter, a bit of a back and forth, a lightness to the conversation.
Yeah.
Is a conversation that I tends to bring out my best as well.
And let's go back for a moment because it's a question that I thought of very early on. I loved it when we spoke about it over dinner once, which was how you became a Rhodes Scholar. Because in that story, there were lessons about going after what you
Yeah.
want, even when other people thought it might be impossible.
Yeah.
That I believe that any level of a person's life or business dreams, they could take something from that brief story. Would you mind sharing it?
Yeah, so it started when I was 14 and I was at high school, and a teacher came up to me, and I don't know why, but he said, "So Michael, what are you planning on doing after high school?" And this was a revelation for me because I hadn't really considered that there was an after high school. But I said to him, just on the spur of the moment, well, I think I'd like to go to Oxford to study because my dad is English. In fact, my dad grew up in Oxford, and so he went as a local boy to Oxford University. And this teacher, rather than mocking me, because I'm in a small town in Australia, went, "Well, you probably need to be a Rhodes Scholar for that." I was like, "Oh, okay. I don't know what that means, but I'll be a Rhodes Scholar." And kind of the seed got planted there. And it's true that in the next 10 years or so, I did a bunch of things that I was like, if I want to be a Rhodes Scholar, this is one way of thinking about that. I remember when, what's the name of that astronaut, that famous Canadian astronaut?
Chris Hadfield.
Yeah, Chris Hadfield. When you read his book, he's like, I decided to be an astronaut at 14, and every decision I made was, is this going to get me closer to being an astronaut or not closer to being an astronaut? Even though, there wasn't such a thing as a Canadian astronaut when he made that decision. So I wasn't as focused as Chris Hadfield, but I kind of was making similar choices. And then I applied to be a Rhodes Scholar. They said, look, everybody gets a first interview, and then we'll see where it goes from there. And I got a letter saying, we're not even going to give you a first interview. It was very demoralizing because they guaranteed that everybody got a first interview. And apparently my application was so bad that I didn't even make that low bar. So I licked my wounds. And then 2 years later, came back to the process, decided to reapply, swallowed my pride, and I had two lucky moments. The first lucky moment was the night before the interview, because I got onto the shortlist. The night before the interview, we went out to dinner in Australia's Parliament House. Super fancy. It's like going to Rideau Hall in Ottawa or somewhere like that. I was like, this is amazing. Very formal dinner. There's the 15 other candidates. There's the 15 interviewers. I was like, I have not a chance here. So what I was going to do is I was going to steal a teaspoon as a memento of this. I was like, this is great. I'll just pocket it, and years to come, I'll tell my kids, look, this is the teaspoon I took from Parliament House, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, luckily I got swept up in trying to impress people. I forgot to steal the teaspoon, which turned out to be a good thing because when you leave Parliament House, you actually leave through metal detectors. Clearly other people had stolen teaspoons. And I suspect I wouldn't be a Rhodes Scholar if they'd found out I'd flinched, I'd nicked a teaspoon. The second key moment was in the interview, and it was pretty intense. You get moved into this room. In my memory, there were it's an old oak room, oak panels, windows that silhouetted the 15 people who were interviewing us. So it's sort of like this, like vague torture scene, these shadowy figures grilling me, interrogating me. And I spent lots of time kind of rehearsing, my answers to all sorts of topics that I didn't really have opinions on, but felt like I should, like, what's the answer to the Middle East? And, how do you feel about capitalism? All these kind of big questions. But the first question took me by surprise. The first question was, so Michael, you've done a degree in literature, you've done a law degree, and you're proposing to do a degree in politics at Oxford. What's wrong with you? Can't you make up your mind? It's like a fairly aggressive first question. And I was taken aback, and I went, well, yes and no. And that made everybody laugh because, can't you make up your mind? Well, yes, no. Clearly, I can't make up my mind. Everybody laughed. I had this is the smartest moment of my life. I was smart enough to realize I had accidentally made a joke. And then I kind of rode that wave. I relaxed, they relaxed. I performed as well as I could, and apparently it was good enough to win that Rhodes Scholarship, and that changed my life because I left Australia, moved to England, met my Canadian wife. We lived in England and the US for a while, but have lived in Canada for 20 some years now. It was a moment.
And what I took away from that, and I take away then and now, is it was an unexpected moment of authenticity, and it was also lightening the room. Like it was, every person they saw was so serious and so intent and forcing, oh my gosh, they're hungry to get a Rhodes Scholarship. And so were you on some level, but it was it was that moment, that pivotal moment, that unexpected epiphany of being humorous without trying to be.
You mentioned Seth, and one of all of Seth's books, two of my favorite. One is The Dip, but the one that's making me think of is Purple Cow, because his whole thing around there is that you got to be different to stand out in the market. And as a leader of an organization, it's really easy to be the same as every other organization in your sector, which means that now you're a commodity, which means you're now competing on price, and that's a losing game for most people. And I mean, Purple Cow didn't exist at this stage, but I had enough of an instinct that when I went for this Rhodes Scholarship, I knew that I wasn't going to win this on my brains or my eloquence. I had to stand out from the pack. I had to be a purple cow. So everybody else showed up, and they were all wearing blue suits and white shirts and pearls or red tie or whatever it was. And I went bold. I had a purple suit on. I had a pink and purple tie-dyed tie. I had long dyed blonde hair. I had all my earrings in. I was like, I'm either going to come a distant last or there's a chance that somehow I might get lucky and win the scholarship. So there's placing a bet on your authenticity, but also figuring out, where am I different? Where am I likely to not be competing head to head? And how do I amplify that so I've got a better chance of standing out?
And when you went through the Rhodes Scholarship program, what was the biggest impact it had on you moving forward?
Well, it had two really significant impacts. One is I met my wife there. And so, in a few months' time, we're celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary. So that turned out really well. The second really significant thing is that it stopped me becoming a lawyer, because I'd done a law degree in Australia. It hadn't gone particularly well. I finished my law degree being sued by one of the law professors for defamation, which is a whole nother story. But quite often, sunk cost. I'm like, well, if I'd stayed in Australia, almost certainly I would have become a lawyer, because, it's like, well, I've spent years getting a law degree. I may as well do the next thing to qualify as a lawyer. Oh, I've qualified as a lawyer. I may as well become a lawyer. Oh, I'm 3 years into a law career. I may as well try and become associate partner. Oh, if another 5 years, I'll just become a partner. And there's a way that you just kind of dig your misery, this idea of sunk cost, which is like, oh, I've done all this, I may as well keep going. And being kind of ripped off that path was great because I'd have been a terrible lawyer. I would have been bad at it and I would have been unhappy. It's a terrible combination. So kind of saving me from that career, catapulting me into a new life in England, and into the world of innovation and creativity first, and then into the way change works, and then into running programs in-house. And then 20 some years ago, founding my own company and growing that and developing that and becoming a writer and all of that. So it's one of those sliding door moments for sure, Jamie.
And you mentioned when you started your business, and our audience are business owners, key executives, and business leaders across the country. So I think they'd be interested, before we move on, to just touch on, take us back to the moment you started Box of Crayons. Why did you start the company, and where are you now with it?
So my guess is many of the people listening, because I think this is true about most people who are part of tech, there was always probably a calling for them to be an entrepreneur. They had that sense of, I'm interested in business, I'm interested in growth, I'm interested in how that stuff works. This is not my story. I started Box of Crayons because I got fired from the job. To rewind, I was living in Boston, being a change management consultant, not having a great time. My wife and I went to our local pub. We had some beer. We each wrote down the name of our 3 favorite cities we'd like to live in on the back of a beer coaster. On the count of 3, we flipped them over. Toronto made both the beer coasters. I'd never been to Toronto, but I was like, I'll give it a shot. So we moved to Toronto. I got a job lined up as a consultant again. But our flight out of Boston, where we were living, to Toronto was on 9/11, which meant that my consulting job disappeared. They found me a temporary job working in-house in what was then called the Independent Order of Foresters, which is a odd non-profit life insurance organization. Anyway, I got fired from that because my work hadn't gone that well. And so out of desperation, I started Box of Crayons. And honestly, in the early days, Jamie, my business model was, can I find somebody with a pulse and a wallet? And then see if I can help them out. I had this kind of miscellaneous grab bag of skills. But fairly quickly, I figured out that ikigai piece, which is like, what do I care about?
Yeah.
What do I think is broken? What is there a need for in the world, and where might people actually pay me for that? And I had trained as a coach, and I'd spent lots of years working internally trying to make change and transformation happen in organizations. And I knew coaching was going to be this really important leadership skill. I could see the power of being more coach-like, being less command and control. And I hated how people were training it. It felt patronizing and slow. And basically, it's like life coaching, but, we'll teach managers how to do life coaching, which I thought was entirely wrong. So I had some fire around going, look, I want managers and I want to unweird coaching for managers and leaders so that it becomes an everyday leadership skill. The core behavior that we teach at Box of Crayons is, can you stay curious a little bit longer? Can you rush to action and advice giving a little bit more slowly? Because most people in most organizations are advice giving maniacs. And when you stay curious a little bit longer, you get to figure out what the real challenge is faster. And you allow the person that you're working with to step in and assume more responsibility more quickly. So I kind of got fired up about that. And after a kind of a desperate bits and pieces start, Box of Crayons really found its focus, which is around that. And then 2016, I published The Coaching Habit, which you kindly introduced. So it's almost 10 years old now. And that's become the best-selling book on coaching and been a real engine behind the success of the company.
And what's your proudest achievement with Box of Crayons?
Well, if I'm honest, Jamie, my proudest achievement is successfully hiring Shannon to replace me as the CEO because, and this may ring true for some of the tech folk listening, it is hard to step aside as a founder. It's also hard to step into the role that a founder has had because founders are generally a nightmare. We're like our DNA is in all the cracks and crevices. We have a heavy gravity, so we distort everything. We get to a point where we're really keen to give up a whole bunch of stuff that we've been doing, but we still want to keep our fingers in too many pies. And most founder transitions fail. And so Shannon and I set up a process. We worked for 2 years. We had a transition coach. We hired somebody for 2 years, a year leading up to it, and a year with Shannon stepping into the role to give us the best chance of this transition, this change actually sticking. And so the fact that I hired Shannon. She has stepped into the role. She is a brilliant woman and a fantastic CEO. I'm extraordinarily proud of her. And I'm now in a position where I can look at Box of Crayons, a company I still own, and see her run this company. She's not caretaker for me. She's running her company. I just happen to be a large shareholder in it. And seeing the company flourish and seeing her flourish, that is the proudest moment for me. I think that's a pretty cool achievement.
That's powerful. And it's even more inspiring because Shannon is a tech member, as we mentioned,
Exactly.
one of our themes. What are some of the strengths and attributes in Shannon that drew you to bring her on and entrust her with the company you started and
Yeah.
moving forward?
Well, I hired Shannon from behind the bar of my favorite pizzeria. So yeah, my wife and I were up there. We're at the bar having a glass of wine. Shannon was serving us, and we got talking because I have a master's degree in literature. My wife has a PhD in literature, and Shannon was doing a PhD in literature. So we're all book geeks. So we're always out talking about great books that we've read and theories and all that sort of stuff. And Shannon was at the time doing a PhD. She was a teaching assistant. She was working behind the bar, and she was also working in an independent publisher in Canada. So she's a very hard worker, and she's got that kind of entrepreneurial spirit. And the publisher won a book of the publishers won the Governor General's Award, which, if you're a Canadian, that's kind of the biggest literary award in Canada. But it was so badly run that they then had to lay her off because they couldn't afford to keep her on and print the extra copies of the books. So Shannon was telling us that, and I said, well, why don't you come and do a little bit of part-time work for me promoting The Coaching Habit, which was just about to come out into the world. And so she came on, and it just went from there. I'm like, oh, you're really good at this. So her attributes are she's got a fiercely big brain. She thinks strategically, I think she sees a bigger picture and she sees patterns. That's part of what I think is that kind of, for me, what strategy is you get to see connections and you get to see patterns. She is hugely responsible, possibly too responsible. I keep having conversations about how she has to perhaps hold things a little more lightly. And she's fearless about figuring out where the next block is in the organization's growth. This theory is that if you're a leader of an organization, really what your job is to figure out the thing that is most broken, that is influencing or having the most impact on the system at the moment, throw as many resources at that as possible to solve it, and then look for the next thing that's next becomes the big block in there. I've just finished reading Dan Heath's latest book. It's not out yet, but by the time this pod comes out, it will be out. It's fantastic. It's about how change works in organizations and systems. And this is called The Theory of Constraints. And she's got a natural gift to um, bring fierce focus to the thing that's not working, and solve that with her and her team.
And just taking a step back with her, something you mentioned was one of the earlier things she helped with was with the coaching habit. I know there are people, if you're listening to this and you've wanted to write a business book, and I know some of you have, because you've mentioned you have things in the offing, but you haven't done it. And in your book, How to Begin, part of that is like, how do you begin? How do you do something that's purposeful enough? This is how I interpreted it, that makes you want to dive into and get started and take action.
Right.
And a lot of people have trouble beginning. What advice would you give based on the way that you started? Because you were rejected several times with that book before you self-published. And that book has gone on to sell 1 million copies, literally 1 in a million in some ways in terms of business books. You wrote also a viral blog when we first met around 2016, 2017 about the process of developing this. Can you summarize that process and even bring in Shannon, if that was part of it, as to how you came up with the idea, some of the process, and then how you ended up promoting it?
So I get asked all the time by people, I want to write a book. And honestly, Jamie, my common response is, are you sure? Because mostly writing a book is a miserable experience. It takes forever. You've got an idea, you write a first draft, you're deeply disappointed by the first draft because it's much harder when you start writing stuff down, everything gets more confusing rather than clearer. You write a second draft, things have got worse. You write a third draft, the wheels are falling off, and now you hate yourself and you hate the idea. By the time you've written the seventh draft, the book is coming into shape, and now you're really kind of like, I can't stand this anymore. You finally get a book out into the world. Maybe you got a publishing deal, although that's hard to get. Maybe you hybrid publish like I do. Maybe you self-publish. And it turns out that almost nobody reads your book. Like 93% of books sell less than 5,000 copies in their lifetime. So it is a really great idea to figure out what you want to say, have an opinion, and maybe find a channel for sharing that. Writing a book is one channel, as is writing a newsletter, as is writing a blog, as is having a TikTok channel, as is doing YouTube, as is hosting a podcast like you, Jamie. So it's a fair question to say, is like, are you sure you want to write a book? And I think there are some really good reasons to do that. One is, I just want to have a book. I want to be able to have a book with my name on it and give it to people every Christmas for the next 70 years because you printed too many copies and you're like, I'm going to give you another copy of my book. But that's a really good reason, which is like, it's important for me to get a book out in the world. For me, I know that when I write a book, I've always got a business model behind it. So, even though I've been lucky with the coaching habit to have sold, 1.5 million copies, it's also true that I can point to tens of millions of dollars of revenue that have come from just 10 copies of that book, because that book was in the right hands of somebody who then moved through the process to buy ongoing support and programs and stuff from Box of Crayons. Part of the reason why the coaching habit is as good as it is, as successful as it is, and I think it is a good book, is that, first of all, it knows what problem it's solving, unweirding coaching for normal people. Secondly, it's a pretty short book. It's like 25,000 words. And a normal business book, that's 60,000. So it's like half the, because I knew who I was writing it for. I was writing it for an executive, probably a woman. She walks into the airport. She's at the airport bookstore, because in these days they had airport bookstores. She sees the book. It looks intriguing. because the title sort of promises a solution and hints at the problem at the same time. She opens it up. It's full of white space. It feels readable. She thinks I could read most of this on my flight, and it's small enough to fit into my handbag. So I knew exactly who I was writing it for. So writing a short book is really helpful. Writing a book that solves a problem. And if this is your world, writing a book that has a business connection to it as well. Like for me, it's that my books are gateways into additional products and services that I can sell to people or offer to people. And then if you think of any books that you know and you love, I can promise you that those books have been written and rewritten and edited and cut and rewritten 1,000 times. So know that the secret to great writing is that the first draft is always a bit crappy, and they get better by just endlessly working them.
And if we transition back to the book that we started with.
Thank you. And I appreciate the interesting journey you've taken us on this as well. So thanks for that, Jamie.
I hope it was it made sense.
It was interesting for me. I hope there are still people listening to this.
When we come back to that, and we talked about the importance of relationships and building thriving relationships that are safe, that are vital, that are repairable. One question that I had while I was reading it was, how do you build relationships at work that are more than just transactional?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is, there's a bunch of working relationships you have that should be pretty transactional, which is we're really clear on what the exchange of goods and services and energy and time and effort is. There's nothing wrong with transactional, and there is a way that even transactional relationships are worth investing in to say, look, how can this be the best transactional relationship that I've got? Like I'm working with somebody to redesign a website at the moment. It's a pretty transactional relationship. Like I'm giving them money and they're building me a website. And we had a conversation where I was like, how do I be your best client? And let me tell you what makes a good vendor and a bad vendor for me. Let me tell you about the vendors I will never hire again because this is the way they annoyed me. Let me tell you about the vendors I keep giving money to and time to and jobs to because I love working with them. And this is an unusual conversation for this website company, but they're like, this is really helpful. This tells us how not to disappoint you and how to amaze you. And it tells me how I can, not be an a-hole and be the person that they're like, oh, I want to work more with Michael and his team around that. So there's nothing wrong with transaction. But if you're thinking about some of your core relationships, like on your executive team, perhaps, or some of the key people on the team that you're leading, or maybe even core clients that you work with if you're in a kind of services industry rather than just a products or goods industry, you may be going, right, how do we go there? And part of it is understanding more deeply the answer to a simple but difficult question, which is like, what do you want? What do you want? So it's really helpful to, when you ask the question, I'm going to go for a random aside here, Jamie, so forgive me. But it's a favorite framework of mine, and it might be helpful for people here. There's a philosopher called Martin Buber, Buber. And he has a very simple but powerful framework around the nature of our relationships. He says you can either have an I-it relationship or an I-thou relationship. And I-it relationships are when things are transactional, but not in a great way. It's like give a bit, take a bit, and you sort of stop seeing the human for what she or he can give you.
People are objectified. They're
more objectified, exactly.
Yeah.
I-thou relationships is you get to see more of the human in front of you. Ideally, you see the whole human in front of you. And I think often in business, there's a pressure to objectify and move away from the humanity of it all. And I think one of the great gifts you can bring as a leader is, perhaps not with everybody, but with some of your key people, which is like, how do I keep circling back to being the human and seeing the human? And this, I mean, I think the 5 questions that are part of the Keystone conversation can help with that. But I also think at the heart of it is like, if you tell me what you want, you're telling me a lot about who you are and how you show up in the world and what makes you happy and what makes you sad. And if I tell you what I want, so there's an equal exchange, then there's a chance of something beyond a transactional relationship to be developed.
Mm-hmm. And when you think of your past experiences in running companies and in work, what from that did you bring into writing this book?
Oh, a lot. I mean, every failed working relationship I've ever had, which is like sadly too many. Um, I wrote How to Work with Almost Anyone because 25 years ago, working with a teacher, a guy called Peter Block, one of the guys whose work has really influenced mine, he taught me something called social contracting. And really, this keystone conversation, a conversation about how we work together rather than jumping to the work itself, is really what Block was talking about, which is like you have that conversation, so let's exchange information. So rather than rushing into the work, let's give ourselves the best chance of understanding each other so that when we do the work together, we bring out our best and we avoid our worst and we have every chance of succeeding. So I've been teaching that to people for many years. I've been using it myself for many years. And this book is a kind of codification and a kind of amplification of some of the ideas there. But, we talked about that story of 2 years working with Shannon to have her really become embedded as the CEO at Box of Crayons. Well, that story really is woven throughout the wisdom in how to work with almost anyone. When I talk to you, when I think of, let's say, Marlene, a woman I worked with for a while, and that was a relationship that ended badly. Something happened. She was very upset. The relationship broke. It never got repaired. That experience, that kind of scar is present or not implicit in the book as well.
Yeah, something in the book that I felt a bit uncomfortable with, but that's not a bad thing. It just was I was reflecting back and also projecting, and I'm reading it down so I get it right. Was the discussion about how do you fix or repair a working relationship that's worth fixing?
Yeah.
I added that last part in particular because I thought, is every working relationship worth fixing? And so, with what surprised you when you were writing this and getting it on paper or however your process is about that idea about when you should in, invest in fixing and repairing a relationship and when you should maybe just let it go, and like Mel Robbins says, the let them theory, just let them be who they are and move on.
Yeah. The tool that somebody taught me, actually Jill, who is our transition coach for 2 years, she's really helpful in teaching me effectively boundaries. And her language is, your job is to worry about your side of the table. Their job is to manage their side of the table. And there's a way that you can be over inclined to take responsibility for everybody's side of the table. And you're like, oh, a good person always repairs all of their working relationships, and I'm a bad person, and I want to be human. And at a certain point, you allow others to be adults. And the annoying thing about allowing people to be adults is they make choices which you don't agree with, or which are hurtful for you, or which leave things unresolved in some ways for you. So I do think often that working relationships are how should I say this? It's worth really seriously considering, is it worth the effort to repair this working relationship? And for many people, the default is no. That, I mean, researching this book and reading across all the kind of great relationship writers like Esther Perel and Terry Real and Dan Siegel and the like, it's really clear that the relationships that last and the relationships that thrive are the relationships that get repaired. And through their research, it's also really clear that most of us are terrible at repairing relationships. It was great for 10 years, and then this one thing happened, and now, it's all over. I can't stand them anymore. But it's also worth saying that sometimes the answer is, look, this is kind of them, not you. This is not repairable. And then the question is, so if this is not going to get any better, what needs to be true for how we proceed from here? Whether that's we have to find a détente, a way of working together, even though we're annoyed with each other and it feels broken. I have to find somebody else to replace this person. I'm not sure what the situation might be, but it's like, what needs to be true for me to be able to progress from here?
Yeah, I like that distinction. I was working with a friend on a project a couple of years ago, and I went with him overseas to help him, and we just didn't get along. And I was devastated because he was a close friend.
Yeah.
Actually, I spoke with him yesterday, and I realized that the relationship was broken. And
Yeah.
I was upset because I liked how we were as friends. We're both fathers. We're married with kids. We live close by. We spoke somewhat regularly, as much as men
Yeah.
do in terms of vulnerability. And I wanted to repair the relationship. So I reached out, which was hard for my ego. And I wanted to frame it as, I'm here for you to help you as a friend. I apologize for what I did. And I named one or two things that I thought I could have handled better. And I framed it as, let's be friends. Yet I'm here to help you with your business, just if I can connect you, or just be a sounding board. And now we're friends again. And that to me was highly uncomfortable throughout the whole process. But
Yeah.
once we went through hell as friends and a business connection, it was for the better. And I felt I grew from knowing sometimes when it's the right person to work with, and
Yeah.
also when friends maybe should stay friends.
So what, I mean, bravo, because that's, as you said, not an easy thing to do. What tipped you into having the courage to have those conversations? Because everybody listening will be familiar enough with the experience of going, well, I'll just forget it. Too hard, too messy, too awkward, too shameful. And they miss that opportunity, but you were brave enough to go back to it. What tipped you into that courageous act?
It was a relationship worth saving and repairing, as you use the word repairing. I don't know. I'm a bit emotional when I say this, but I felt often I let it go, or
Yeah.
the fight or flight. I'm the flight type, and it just meant more to me than not being in some form of a friendship with him,
Yeah.
because we had met in a men's group 12 years ago where we were both vulnerable, and we both did this weekend, and we knew things about each other that we didn't often share. We wouldn't have shared professionally, and
Yeah.
they weren't bad things or secrets. They were just men being vulnerable, which is rare
Yeah.
with men. And I remembered back to that 12 years ago, and I said, that was bigger than our disagreements in our style. He's much
Yeah.
more type A aggressive, and I'm a little bit not softer, but my style is not in your face. And I
Yeah.
just realized it's a difference of styles. It's not that we don't get along. We just get along in different contexts.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
Uh, it's fair to say that, if you're brave enough to get into the repair process, or brave enough to have a keystone conversation, 5 questions to ask and answer, and hey, how should we work together? What should we exchange about each other so we have the best chance for that? It just doesn't always work. I mean, I wish that it did. I wish it was one of those, oh, this is a guaranteed winner. But it doesn't always work. But if it works, I think, if it works half the time, then you're ahead. If it works 70% of the time, you're really ahead because you get to renew, refresh, strengthen, kind of reset important relationships for you.
Mm-hmm. And on that point of relationships, as we wrap this up, your books have impacted me as a podcast host in the relationships I have with my family and people around me because they're so clear and simple and memorable in order to actually use them. And so I haven't actually thanked you for that when we've spoken before, but I want to thank you for the impact you've had on me. And I know you've impacted you who are listening because you've told me. And so I want to end with saying if you haven't seen this book yet or haven't picked it up, the quality and the really game-changing and life-changing without hyperbole Michael's books have had on millions of people. It's how to work with almost anyone. And I have three quick questions for you, Michael, as we end. The first is a question from the coaching habit, which is like, what's on your mind now? What are you working on right now?
Yeah. Well, what I'm working on right now, two things. One is a 10-year anniversary edition of the Coaching Habit. So kind of figuring out what to add without overwhelming that book. So that's fun. But the bigger project is something called Change Signal, which is about trying to freshen up how we think about change in organizations. It doesn't feel like a lot of really contemporary thinking there. It feels a bit stale, a bit old, a bit factory farmed, and I want to kind of rewild change. So I've got a new podcast and a new newsletter launching in February. So thechangesignal.com something should be up by the time somebody listens to this. If you're interested in the tagline is cut through the blather, the BS, and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change management.
Oh, I love it. And by the time this comes out, we will put a link to that so
That'd be great.
you can find it. And is there any other places that we can find you?
Yeah, the hub is a website, mbs.works, and that gives you access to, the books. Every book I've written has a ton of free stuff and downloads and extra resources, and you don't even need the book for that. So feel free to get to mbs.works and pillage to your heart's content.
Wonderful. And I'm going to end with the best person I can imagine asking this question to, which is, what's a question I didn't ask that I should have asked on this podcast?
Right. Yeah, I do love that question. I have a variation of that myself, which is what needs to be said that hasn't yet been said in this conversation. So I appreciate that. You asked a lot of good questions. I really appreciated being able to tell a few good stories. I can't think of a question to add there. I really liked where we finished with this, which was this conversation about this doesn't always work. Repair doesn't always work. Keystone conversations don't always work. But they're worth attempting. I mean, there's a saying I heard once. Somebody said, look, nobody likes to be the first person to say hello, but everybody loves to be greeted. And in a situation like this, where you're like, what does it mean to be the person to think about, to bring up, how do we work better together? Because as you said, vulnerability is tough. I think it is probably a little harder for men often, not all men, but often in general. If you're courageous enough to be the person to say, look, I care about the quality of our working relationship, not just for some touchy-feely reason, but because actually we'll get better work done. Being the person brave enough to start things off is a really powerful gift to the other person, to your organization, and to yourself as well.
Michael, what I loved about this conversation and found useful is you have this gift, this brilliance of combining useful, actionable tips with appropriate levels of vulnerability through stories that people can relate to, and also weave them in a way that are sticky, that are not just memorable, but that will absorb within us so we can take it out into the work world. So thank you so much for being a guest. It's an honor and a pleasure as always. Michael Bungay Stanier, have a good day.
Jamie, thank you. That was a delight.
And this is a leadership standard. If you haven't already, if you want to hear more conversations from the world's best thought leaders on leadership, subscribe and leave us a review. We'd appreciate it to get the word out. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Leadership Standard Podcast, brought to you by TEC Canada. TEC Canada's proven process of peer advisory groups, one-to-one executive coaching, thought leadership from subject matter experts, and national and global networks all provide a lasting impact, not just on your business, but on your life. Your ability to deal with fast-paced change will accelerate. Your decision-making will become more decisive. You'll be a better leader. Learn more at tec-canada.com. Keep leading with excellence, and see you next time on the Leadership Standard Podcast.